Good afternoon. This is Ed Salzberg. I'm the Managing Director of the Security and Sustainability Forum, and I welcome you to the first webinar in our Future of Sustainable Transportation Fuels webinar series on anchoring themes. The session is hosted by Arizona State University's Lightworks and Lightspeed Solutions. I'm really pleased that Gary Dirks, who's the Director of Lightworks and also the Director of ASU's Global Institute of Sustainability, is moderating the session. He brings a tremendous background in the energy field. I want to call your attention to our LinkedIn group, which we formed to support the series. You can continue the conversation after this webinar by joining the Future of Sustainable Transportation Fuels LinkedIn group, and also help us frame up the rest of the series, joining conversations with the panelists on this session and for subsequent sessions. I'm really grateful to the associations and organizations that have helped us promote the event. They include the Commercial Aviation Alternative Fuels Initiative, the Solar Energy Research Center, ACORE, the American Council on Renewable Energy, the Environmental Law Institute, National Association of State Energy Officials, and ASERTI, the Association of State Energy Research Technology Transfer Institutions. I'm grateful to Lightworks and to Lightspeed Solutions for their hosting of the event. Lightworks pulls light-inspired research at ASU under one strategic framework, and Lightspeed Solutions is a collaborative effort among multiple institutions to develop energy systems that use sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to produce sustainable, scalable, and infrastructure-compatible liquid hydrocarbon fuels. And this session was designed by Dr. Ellen Stechel, who's the Deputy Director of Lightworks and the Managing Director of Lightspeed Solutions. And I just thank Ellen for all of her insights in putting this together. We have several more webinars coming up in addition to the Future of Sustainable Transportation Fuels, which will be 4 monthly sessions starting this month and continuing for the next several months. We're also doing an urban resilience series, a food series, and a global climate security series, and these are all with Arizona State University. Just a real innovative program there. A lot of insight into developing these really timely webinars. You can follow the registration at our website, ssfonline.org. That gets you to the Security and Sustainability Forum website, and you can put your email in and get updates or register for upcoming programs. Here's how this session is going to work. I'm going to introduce Gary Dirks, the moderator, and he is going to do a short presentation to set the stage, and then introduce the panelists, and you've seen them you've seen their backgrounds in the email. It's just an outstanding group. We're going to do some discussion questions with the panelists, or we may just turn right to audience questions, depending upon how many come through and the topics that they're covering. You can submit those questions through the side panel, and I ask you to take the brief exit survey that pops up at the end. It helps us improve the quality of these sessions. Gary's the director of the Global Institute of Sustainability, and he has a tremendous energy background. Before joining ASU, he's the president of BP Asia Pacific and also the president of BP China. He has just a tremendous background and a great facilitator. He's managed one of our sessions before. And Gary, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ed, and thanks to our audience for taking time to join us for this first of a 4-part series on exploring the future of sustainable transportation fuels. As you can see from our slide, the medium to longer term goal that we have for this webinar series is to begin exploring mechanisms by which we might achieve sustainable low net carbon transportation fuels. Our aim is to stimulate a conversation about this space, in particular how we might innovate in this space for the purposes of identifying, in particular, input to policy makers for ways in which this goal could be facilitated. As Ed already indicated, we are excited about the possibility of having all of you involved in this conversation. So please do submit questions for our panelists. I will give priority to your questions. And as Ed also indicated, there is the associated LinkedIn discussion group. This is an important way in which we will be getting input from you. We do have ideas about what the upcoming monthly webinars should be about or could be about. but those subject areas are not entirely firm. In other words, your input will matter. Next slide, Ed. So the goals for today is to begin this process of stimulating a conversation around low net carbon transportation fuels. We think that there is the potential for this time being the right time to be accelerating the transition to these kinds of fuels. I would note that it is going to be important to have good ideas and to promote those ideas if we are going to make this transition. Many of the audience may have noted a few days ago that Rex Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, made a statement at his annual general meeting when asked about climate change. We on purpose choose not to lose money, talking about alternative fuels. And while I haven't had a chance to study it in detail, I understand that the new EPA mandates came out this morning. And yet again, it looks like the targets will be below the expectations of when the law was originally passed. So there's a lot going on in this space, a lot of opportunity to think about how to transition. Some of this is coming because of technical advances and better understandings about what these opportunities would be. Much of it is a bigger dynamic, and we'll be talking some about what that bigger dynamic is. So we look forward to being able to try to stimulate additional conversation around this theme of low carbon fuels, and we hope that this will be a starting point. We want to emphasize that we are, in 4 webinars, we're not going to be able to be comprehensive. We're not going to be able to cover everything that we could cover, nor is the intent to try to come up with the answers. It is very much to explore what this space is about and start generating some ideas about how we might go forward from there. So with that, I would like to introduce a truly extraordinary panel we have today, all of whom are coming from very different perspectives, but who have spent many years working on the subject of energy, and a lot of that on the subject of low carbon energy. So first we have Paul Bryan. Paul is with the Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering Department at the University of California, Berkeley. Speaking second will be Sharon Burke. She's the Senior Advisor at the New American Foundation. Speaking third will be Catherine Clay. She's Vice President for Policy Strategy at the American Gas Association. And last but not least, Mike Taymor, who is a Technical Fellow at Ford Research at Ford Motor Company. So with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Paul Bryan, who will kick us off. Paul.
Great. Well, thank you, Gary, and thanks also to the organizers for pulling this together, and to the audience for showing up to listen. Before my current role as a teacher at Berkeley and consultant in the field of biofuels, I was Vice President for Biofuels Technology at Chevron, and then later manager of what's now called the Bioenergy Technology Office at the Department of Energy. I think that there's a real critical need for the development of low carbon fuels, and I'm truly concerned that development has proceeded at a very slow pace. I'm going to talk about 4 things that I think are not necessarily well understood and that are standing in the way of the development of those renewable low-carbon fuels, and I'm calling this the sine qua non of alternative transportation fuels, which is a little bit of a play on the Latin phrase sine qua non. So the first point I'd like to make is that renewable alternatives are not going to compete with fossil fuels on the basis of production cost at any point in the 21st century. This is from a recent paper in Nature. The reference is noted there. And this shows the cost of production in 2010 dollars per barrel of oil of all the remaining recoverable reserves of oil that we have in the world. And I'm not going to get into what the purple and green and orange and black and gray bars mean. It's just that on the left-hand side we have proven reserves, mostly in the hands of OPEC, that can be produced mostly for less than $20 a barrel. That's total production cost. Then we have the conventional oil that is not yet proven but is likely to be, all of which we can probably produce for less than $40 a barrel. And then things get more and more difficult as we move to reserves that are either harder to produce or harder to process or both. And so we have a sort of a conventional supply curve here. To give you some context, the star here indicates the volume of oil that has been produced in all of history. So in 150 years or so of trying very hard and producing very aggressively, that's the amount we've produced. So you can see pretty clearly that for less than $20 a barrel, we can produce almost that much again, and for less than 40, we can produce about double that, and ultimately something around 5 times that amount is available. So it's not like we're running out of crude oil anytime soon. It does get more and more expensive as we go along. If we look at renewable fuels, this is a rough number for corn and cane ethanol. I really didn't want to get into a big argument about the costs of each and exchange rates between Brazilian reais and American dollars and things like that. But this is a reasonable cost of production of corn and cane ethanol. As you can see, it's well above the cost of crude oil. If we look at cellulosic ethanol, oops, go the right direction, it'll help. If we look at cellulosic ethanol, where that sits today is far worse. Really, virtually all of the recoverable oil in the world is cheaper than where we are with cellulosic ethanol right now. Now, I'll make a quick point here. Crude oil obviously is not a finished fuel, so I should bump all the crude oil numbers up about 20-25% to account for transportation and refining. But at the same time, ethanol has about 30% less energy density than hydrocarbon fuel, so I should bump those up about 30%. So those roughly cancel out, and I think this is a fair comparison because of that. So I think it's important to understand that on extraction and refining cost alone, we're not going to compete with renewable fuels. The next thing to point out is that renewable alternatives offer many important benefits, but as of today, none of those profit the private investors whose capital we'd like to attract into the biofuels business. If we look at these advantages, number one, we can significantly reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of transportation. Number two, we can really reinvigorate the economy of rural America. Number three, we can improve the U.S. balance of trade by reducing petroleum imports. Number four, we can improve our energy security by reducing dependence on foreign oil. We can get rid of these military costs and diplomatic constraints that are connected with the need to protect crude oil production and maintain the trade routes. We can also do a lot to support technology leadership in biotech and advanced materials. The problem is, if you look at all of those wonderful potential benefits, not one of them puts a dime in the pocket of the people we'd like to get to invest. Until we can somehow monetize these benefits, and first and foremost the greenhouse gas issue, we're not going to attract the private capital that we need to move this sector along. Number three, biotechnology, which is where we have spent most of our money in producing alternative biofuels, is unlikely ever to be competitive as a means of producing fuels. I look at cellulosic ethanol as also being a lignin to coal technology. Lignocellulosic biomass is 20 to 30% lignin by mass. The lignin actually carries more energy per unit mass than the cellulosic part that we're looking to ferment into ethanol. Therefore, about 1/3 of the energy of lignocellulosic biomass is lignin. We're likely to be paying $5 to $6 per million BTU for that biomass in quantity, whereas coal is only worth about $2 per million BTU. So when we biologically convert the cellulose in lignocellulosic biomass to ethanol and leave the ethanol of lignin behind simply to be burned, it's actually harder to burn than coal, and it's going to be burned at a smaller scale. So we're really degrading 1/3 of the energy that we've grown and collected to a fuel with less than coal value. As a result, I think that biological conversion will be a great way to make chemicals and higher value materials, but thermochemical conversion, which upgrades the lignin as well as the cellulose to liquid fuel value, is going to be the best way to make fuels. That's not where we've been spending the bulk of our money, and we really have to move in that direction if we're going to make an impact on fuels. Finally, biofuels is really my area, so I'm not going to talk in any great detail about other alternative transportation fuels. But I do feel that biogas and electric vehicles are very promising, but they're only promising if we're decarbonizing the natural gas and the electric grids faster than we're creating new demand for that energy in the transportation sector. Otherwise, all we're doing is creating new demand for fossil energy, natural gas on the gas grid and the electric grid, and above all, coal on the electric grid. So it's very easy to think when you're driving an electric car that you have no emissions because you don't have any out the tailpipe, but you are driving the electric grid. And nowadays in the United States, a lot of that is coal. So those are 4 things I wanted to highlight as part of this conversation, and at this point I'll turn it over to Sharon to move us forward.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul. That was a very interesting presentation. So I am now a senior advisor at New America, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. But I was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy until fairly recently. And that is the point of view from which I'll speak today, although I should be clear that I do not represent the Department of Defense anymore, so these are my own views. Defense is an interesting place to talk about when it comes to fuels, because it's a consumer of fuel and a very large consumer of fuel. It's not just any consumer either. And that these pictures on the front here, I chose them advisedly because those are all refueling operations. The first one is air, the second is maritime, and the third is ground. Those little black parachutes are actually fuel being dropped in Afghanistan, and the soldiers are going to pick it up. Just to make the point visually right away that while we are just another consumer of fuel, we're not just another consumer of fuel. First of all, DoD is just an enormous enterprise, something like 3 million personnel, an annual budget that's between $5 billion and $1 trillion, depending on what you count. DoD has a presence in every country in the world, and quite a significant one in some places. And then once you count the industrial base, the defense sector has an even larger footprint as far as economic activity and fuel consumption. For the purposes of today, though, I'm just going to focus on direct defense activities, what the department itself does. So there we go. So let's talk again about scale here. The Department of Defense is a prodigious user of liquid fuels. If it were a country, this is where it would rank. It uses about 246,000 barrels of oil a day. I think last year that added up to about 4 billion gallons for the year. And it costs the department, last year it cost about $15 billion, and they're anticipating about $16 billion this year. It really depends on what kinds of operations they're involved in. The department buys fuel worldwide, so global availability of this liquid fuel is crucial, and the logistics of obtaining and moving the fuel are extremely important. So for example, the Department of Defense has a goal of having one fuel on the battlefield. Which is why they use jet fuel in everything when they're operating forward. So whether it's a generator or a combat vehicle or an airplane, they're going to be using jet fuel on the battlefield, just again as a matter of logistics. So think in terms of availability. And I would say that the department buys about 60% of its fuel overseas. Again, it depends on what kinds of operations they're involved in. Keep in mind also, and this is, I'm talking about, its scale, but also timeline here. The department has a considerable investment in end-use items that consume liquid fuels and very slow turnover of its fleet. So these are trillions of dollars of investment of your tax dollars in vehicles and ships and planes, and some of these are going to be in the U.S. arsenal for decades. The first thing I did when I came into office was go visit a aircraft carrier, which was largely powered by a nuclear reactor, but also has fuel on board for aircraft, that was 50 years old. So we are talking about fleets that are going to be around for a very long time, and they are designed, with the exception of things like nuclear aircraft carriers, they are designed to use liquid fuels. They are designed to use petroleum. Retrofitting them to use some other kind of fuel source will be extremely expensive and very difficult. So the department has an interest in having a long-term liquid fuel supply. And keep in mind also, you're talking about an institution that has a long planning horizon, multiple planning horizons really. They plan in year-long budgets, in a 5-year-long budget cycle, and then there are planning cycles that can be as long as 30 years as far as looking ahead at what the future threat environment looks like. So I think that's the context in which the department has often looked at its liquid fuel time horizons. But you have to put this in perspective. So DoD is a very significant user of fuels in this country, and you will hear people say all the time that the military is the largest user of fuels in the United States, and that is true as a single institution. But that accounts for a little more than 1% of U.S. domestic use. So there's a lot of interest in DoD and how its effect on the fuels market, but it's not that big an effect. The department can certainly be a catalyst for change, but 99% of the rest of the economy has to go along with it if you're talking about something like a global commodity market. So it's an interesting question about just how much influence does DoD have when you're talking about liquid fuels. Within the Department of Defense universe, air is definitely the biggest consumer. The Air Force accounts for 53% of all fuel consumption in the Department of Defense, and the picture there is a Galaxy C5, I believe. It's a big cargo aircraft, and that is the big consumer within the Air Force, is mobility and strategic lift. So big planes that move a lot of stuff, and it's worth keeping in mind that they're responding to demand signals from the rest of the armed forces. So, and the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Army all have air in their arsenals as well. Those are also the big users when it comes to their fuel demand. So it's air travel when it comes to the Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense has made an investment in alternative fuels development, and it started in about 2007 in the George W. Bush administration. Between 2007 and 2012, that investment totaled about $48 million, produced about 1.9 million gallons. These were research, development, test, and evaluation dollars. So these were not commercial purchases of alternative fuels. They were research projects, and in a couple of cases, they were demonstration projects. As you can see, I sliced and diced it by feedstock, and so the department has tested and evaluated and certified pretty much all defense equipment to operate on a range of feedstocks. So most defense equipment has been approved to operate on blends of all of these feedstocks at this point. Alcohols, I think, is still fairly new in the testing, and you can see that sugar-based fermented sugars are as well. But the thing is that DoD has a policy that that's been, I believe, codified, that they will only buy alternative fuels when they are price competitive with conventional fuels. And there is also an interesting restriction. Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. There's a separate project that the department entered into, driven by the Department of the Navy, through the Defense Production Act Title III, which was to produce advanced biofuels, and that is a project to produce these biofuel refineries. Just not too long ago, they made the award to start construction on 3 refineries, and this is funded with DOE as well, and USDA has provided some separate funding for commodity credits. There's at least a 50% match from the private sector for this, so it's a considerable investment. The three feedstocks were tallow, municipal solid waste, and woody biomass. So, and one of the requirements of that particular award was that they had to be able to produce it at a price competitive rate, and most of them are coming in under $4 a gallon. I think all of them are saying they're going to come in under $4 a gallon. Now, one thing I would point out that was always interesting to me is that's, of course, very important, and I think that this project is aimed at scaling up and seeing what you get when you try to scale these enterprises, but none of those resources is scalable in a larger sense. So if you're looking at a continuum or a portfolio of kinds of sustainable fuels, these ones are somewhat limited, more than somewhat. And what I wanted to say, too, about these investments is they're controversial. So as soon as the first one hit the hustings, which was a coal-to-liquid investment in 2007 and 2008, there was immediately legislation passed to limit what could be done, and that was the Section 526 of the 2007, I think, Energy Independence and Security Act, which limited the department's ability to invest in coal-to-liquid, essentially. Since then, with the Obama administration focusing on renewable biofuels every single year, there's been legislation in the defense authorization trying to limit the department's ability to do just that, including some specifically oriented at this DPA investment, trying to kill it, limit it, or otherwise derail it. So every single year there's been hostile legislation, and every single year some amount of it has gotten through. So I think that that points to a larger problem here, which is this, DOD is such a big enterprise, and defense is such a unique mission, and everyone's well aware that there's a strong innovation pull in the defense mission that's brought us all kinds of notable technologies that have crossed over or have come full circle in the private sector, including this wonderful platform that we're all communicating on right now, originated in the defense sector. And so I think there's a lot of hope that DOD can stimulate the investment in this area that can get us all down the road to a sustainable fuel. I certainly hope that these investments and the fact that the department has signaled that it can use these and that a biofuel blend, a 50-50 petroleum biofuel blend, will work in a very high performance engine, that those things are worth something. But to my mind, this is trying to use the department's scale to be an innovation push. And if we sustain it over time, it might help, but if you go back to that DOD uses a lot of fuel but is actually a pretty small portion of a very large market, I'm not sure that DOD really has the capacity to change a whole commodity market. And so I just wanted to wrap up with a last comment. This may seem like a huge departure from what I've just been saying, but let me explain why I put this in here. So originally, DOD in the 1970s started putting money into global positioning systems. They began to put capital into what was then called Navstar, which became GPS later, in the 1970s. There was no commercial investment in that, as far as I know, at that time. And then as it started to emerge in the 80s and 90s, we were talking about a $5 billion DOD investment. And then you can see what happened there in the late 90s, which is the commercial market for this capability vastly eclipsed the defense market. But you have to come back to that 1970s original investment. Why did the Department of Defense put money there? It's because it was a defense capability we needed in order to execute the defense mission, something that we had to do in order to be able to meet the basic mission of defending the country. GPS gave us that means. So when you harness a defense mission, a defense need, a defense capability to innovation, it can be a tremendous pull. When you're just talking about DoD's scale and the fact that it's a big place with a lot of money, that's a lot harder to sustain, and it's a lot harder to get the kind of innovation we're looking for. So I think the challenge going forward is to ask, is there a defense, if you want to use the defense sector to try to pull sustainable fuels along, I think you need to find a stronger driver within the defense community to provide that pull. And that's not impossible. So for example, if you haven't read the news today, you should. Things are heating up in the South China Sea. It's getting pretty tense there. Well, think about these freedom of navigation operations that the United States is engaged in there. You know, I've told you that air operations, but also maritime operations take an enormous amount of fuel, and that is a long way away from us. And we're going to have to obtain the fuel at a great distance, at great cost. If we have a greater refueling capacity, and not only that, you think about the Asia-Pacific region, our partnerships there are really important. They're strategically important, geostrategically important, tactically important in every way for the military. If you look at those partnerships and the need that the United States has to have access in that region, then you could start talking about whether there aren't some joint biofuel refinery projects that would make sense, where the commercial return, which Paul spoke so convincingly on, is less important than the strategic return, and you're also talking about fuel-poor countries like the Philippines. So if that's the justification for making an investment like that, it seems to me that that's a stronger innovation pull. So I just wanted to finish with that to make the point that this is not to say, you know, the fact that I think that DoD's investments to date are not likely to be successful in making biofuels competitive, certainly not in a scalable way. That's not to say that there aren't some ways that we could still harness the defense sector to help us move down the road. And with that, I would like to turn it over to the next speaker, who is, I have backup slides, which are fair game for questions once we get to that point. And I guess I need to go past those.
And Sharon, I'm going to take over and run the slides for Catherine.
Great. And that will turn over to Catherine Clay, who is the Vice President for Policy and Strategy at the American Gas Association, and I can't wait to hear what she has to say.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Sharon, and thanks to everyone at Lightworks and ASU for the opportunity to be part of today's webinar. So I'm going to be focusing my comments on one particular alternative, and that is natural gas as an alternative transportation fuel. But I'll say at the outset, I actually came to natural gas by way of working on biofuels. I worked on the Renewable Fuel Standard when I was a staffer with the Senate Energy Committee. I did my PhD on electric vehicle batteries and then worked in the auto industry to help facilitate policies that would acknowledge the benefits that electric vehicles bring to our transportation sector. And now coming at it from the perspective of the natural gas industry, I can tell you that, that many of the policy challenges that we face for one alternative fuel are shared by the other alternatives. It always comes down to the tension between putting our policy, political will and our dollars towards the vehicles or towards the infrastructure. One depends on the other, and the more that we can facilitate growth in vehicles, the more the infrastructure benefits, and vice versa. The problem is that we have to avoid that waiting game that can occur. So with that perspective that there are these common challenges for all of the alternatives, and so the lessons that we take from each one can help us promote the others. Let me now turn exactly to why natural gas is such an emerging issue and is getting so much attention around the country, and that is the map that you see before you here on shale gas resources. So our national energy landscape has changed dramatically in the last decade. Back when I was with the Senate Energy Committee back in 2005 and 2007 when we were passing major energy legislation, one of the things that we were very concerned about was the nearing scarcity of natural gas. The prospect of becoming dependent on imports of natural gas, and the way that we were at the time becoming ever more dependent on imports of petroleum. Now, of course, with the advent of the shale resources for both gas and for petroleum in North America, we have a vastly different energy picture for the nation for many decades to come. this graph gives you a sense also of not just the scale, but the geographic diversity of the shale gas resource. There are 33 of our 50 states that are now producing or have produced natural gas. It is really staggering, the amount of natural gas that we're producing. We have surpassed Russia as the world's #1 producer of natural gas. This new landscape also allows us to think differently about the resource. It opens up opportunities not just for transportation, but also as a way to fuel our manufacturing sector and giving us a competitive edge with lower cost energy. But across the economy, perhaps the one sector where we are most where we have the most potential gain is in transportation, because while overall our economy depends on natural gas for about 25% of its primary energy, only about 0.1 to 0.2% of our transportation energy derives from natural gas. So let's go to the next slide. And there you can see also that magnitude that I'm talking about. So these numbers come from what's called the Potential Gas Committee, which is run out of the Colorado School of Mines. So it is a academic, but also in partnership with industry group on a biannual basis, updates our nation's estimates of our fuel supply in natural gas. And you can see that something quite significant started to happen in the 2000s. You start to see that curve ramp up, and it really takes off though between 2006 and 2008, and we haven't seen any slowdown in that increase in our estimates for our reserves. And what's going on there are a couple of things. One is that we are increasingly understanding the reserves. We're understanding how we can assess the extent of each different basin with its different geology, how much gas is there, and we're also improving our technology so that we can more cost effectively raise that gas up out of the ground. So we now have well over 100 years, it's 150, maybe even approaching by some estimates, 200 years of supply at our given rate of consumption on an annual basis. So we really have become a world-class producer of natural gas in a way that was unimaginable just a few short years ago. So let's go to the next slide. Given that, I think if I had imagined you before I changed the slide here to imagine if I told you, well, given our leadership position in natural gas on the production side, if I told you that there were 16 million natural gas vehicles on the road worldwide and asked you to imagine what fraction of those vehicles you might think would be in the U.S. market, I think many people would imagine a much higher number in North America than what you see presented here in the numbers before you. So of that 16 million, barely over 1% of those 16 million vehicles that run on natural gas around the globe today, just over 1% of those, only 1% are here in North America. So other nations are embracing natural gas in a much more forward-leaning way than we are in the United States. Asia is perhaps the biggest sector of adoption. China and India, some very surprising countries like Pakistan actually are very aggressively promoting natural gas in their transportation sector. South America is also in a real leadership position in promoting natural gas. Europe, and particularly Europe, is focused in Germany and Italy. And every nation that is adopting natural gas vehicles comes at it because of a range of options, but normally the emphasis is on one particular aspect of it, depending on the national context. Interestingly, in China and India, it's primarily about air quality. Natural gas is an inherently cleaner burning fuel, and you are able to add on pollution control devices to gasoline or diesel vehicles, but at least in many contexts, it can be more cost effective. Instead of requiring those expensive pollution control technologies, if you start with natural gas, you can avoid the need for those add-ons and you can achieve air quality benefits in that way. Some other reasons are wanting to have fuel diversity for energy security reasons. That's important to many nations. That's one of the motivators for some of the South American countries, for example. But it just it also can be economics. In North America, one of the reasons that we're seeing growth in natural gas vehicles is that this new abundance means natural gas prices are much lower and perhaps even more importantly are more stable than they historically have been. And going forward, we can expect that abundance of natural gas to translate into low and stable prices. Petroleum, now we are growing as a leader in production of petroleum, but petroleum is going to maintain a global market and a global price. Natural gas is priced on a more regional basis. And so natural gas from North America is inherently less vulnerable to the price fluctuations that can be caused in the oil market because of political volatility elsewhere in the world. So it's not just the relative price at any given moment, but it's that long-term profile of less volatile, more stable prices. And let's go to the next slide. That economics and that outlook for not just low but stable natural gas prices is what's driving growth both on the fleet vehicle side and especially in certain niches like city buses. Very interestingly, waste management fleets, waste disposal fleets. Garbage trucks are almost certainly going to go nearly 100% to natural gas over the next few years, just because the economics are so compelling for that market, and the return to base aspect of their operation makes it makes the logistics very favorable for natural gas. Overall, we're seeing the economics drive not just fleet purchases, but very favorable growth in the infrastructure. So this chart shows you the growth in just the compressed natural gas side. There's a similar kind of curve for stations for liquefied natural gas. LNG is more suited to our long-haul trucking. Compressed natural gas, or CNG, is a little bit logistically easier to operate. It is simply compressed rather than supercooled and liquefied. And so for most urban applications, your fleets are going to be looking at CNG. And these stations here shown on this chart are the growth in compressed natural gas stations, both private and public contained together in this graph. It's about half and half. So about half of the numbers that you see here consistently through the years of data shown, about half of those would be owned by a fleet operator and would be what they call behind the fence. So they would be restricted to the use by that fleet owner, would be fenced off and not available for public use. But half of them are public stations that anyone can use. Many of these are owned and operated by our members in the American Gas Association, and those are the natural gas utilities. It's a good story going forward, and you can see that the growth rate actually since 2012 to this year, including the newly announced stations, is 60%. So very strong growth in our sector. And then just to the next slide, and I think that concludes my prepared remarks, and I will look forward to further discussion and all of your questions.
Okay, we're going to turn this over to Mike Tamor, and Mike, you have slide control.
Okay, let me get to a slide here. All right, I don't appear to have control. Here we are. Okay, so as you were told, my name is Mike Tamor. I'm a Henry Ford Technical Fellow for Energy Systems and Sustainability at Ford. I could explain at some length what that involves, but the main point here is that ever since I switched out of material science, I've been involved in the optimization of vehicle systems, starting with hybrid electric vehicles, but I've worked on all the favorite alternative fuel vehicles, hybrid electric, all electric, fuel cell, plug-in hybrid, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles as well as hydrogen ICE vehicles, and most recently a little bit on natural gas. But a more important part of my work has been looking at the relationship between future fuel economy regulation and Ford's climate change promise, and the relationship to the renewable fuel picture, basically a broad look at the future of transportation energy. And I'm going to be taking a slightly different look, more from the demand side than the supply side than the previous speakers did. And I'm very glad to be going last because I think it's the perfect way to set up a discussion. So what I'd like to begin with is Ford's sustainability commitment, which is basically to do its part to achieve atmospheric CO2 stabilization at 450 parts per million, which is broadly accepted, although this is unprovable, to be the atmospheric CO2 concentration that would result in only a 2 degrees C in global temperatures, which is considered about the limit that we could go to without triggering really catastrophic disruptions. Although, of course, there are many who would argue that even that's too much, but the commitment was for 450, and that target is widely used and even aligns roughly with the present round of fuel economy standards from most major markets. But what does that really mean? Well, what that means is that global emissions, if you're to follow the the black line, which is the lowest of the four here, actually have to decrease by 40% by 2050 and by over 80% by 2100. But in the transportation world, transportation demand is expected to more than double over the next 35 years to 2050. Most of that growth is outside the U.S., but a good fraction of it is. So what does that mean? It means that on a per kilometer distance traveled basis, vehicle CO2 emissions on average have to decrease by about twice the rate that these emissions of CO2 have to decrease, which translates to about a 3 to 4% annual reduction in the CO2, not from new vehicles, but that's from all vehicles, year by year for the next 35 years. And given that a vehicle is on the road for an average of something like 16 years, and sometimes as long as 18 years, that means that to force that total fleet, the total, what we call the park, all the vehicles that are out on the road down, we have to make all the new vehicles go down even faster than that, which leads to sort of an interesting problem. And that is, technology only does so much without really disrupting what a car or a truck has to do. It has to be safe, it has to carry the loads, it has to be comfortable, and so on. And what happens is that as fuel economy goes up, the customer savings of incremental fuel economy goes down. So, for example, if on the upper left there, if gasoline, this is an older example, was $3.80 a gallon, improving your fuel economy from, say, 25 miles per gallon to 40 miles per gallon only saves you $360 a year, but the technology to do that might cost you $3,000 or $4,000. Similarly, on the right, just for a theoretical hybrid electric vehicle going from 30 to 45, at today's gasoline prices, means that it takes 9 years for your investment in fuel savings to pay itself back, which means that customers really won't look at it because, in general, if they do the math at all, they look for a payback in no more than 3 or 4 years. So we have a vicious circle that the fuel economy technology keeps getting more expensive while the amount of money that it saves keeps going down. Declining consumption and the fracking revolution that you just heard about, and the immense supply of oil that we have is going to keep oil prices low. So it's really become difficult and then impossible to look to the vehicles to keep reducing CO2 from transportation. So as a rough rule to remember, sometime after 2025, further CO2 reductions from transportation really have to be coming out of the fuel. The affordable vehicle change will be pretty much all used up by then. So what does that mean? Well, what I want to do in my portion here is to promote the idea of separating the idea of alternative fuel from renewable energy. Fuel is just fuel. It's a carrier of energy. So the question is, what properties of a fuel do we look for? And if you look at what the fundamental properties of a fuel are, there really only are two fuels. There's only two elements on the periodic table that you can use safely and efficiently as the energy carriers. That's hydrogen and carbon. Other atoms might be included for other purposes, like, for example, oxygenates or lubricants and things like that, but they're not carrying the energy. All they're doing is modifying the combustion process. The energy in ethanol comes from the hydrogen and carbon, not from the oxygen. So whether we're talking about renewable fuel or talking about fossil fuel, hydrogen and carbon are the only chemical carriers we can use. And of course, we can treat electricity as a fuel, but it has its own difficulties. If we compare these three fuels, they are the only alternative fuels, that is the form of the fuel. You discover that if you take a vehicle that is just a canonical base 30 mile per gallon vehicle, re-equip it as a hybrid, re-equip it as a fuel cell vehicle, or re-equip it as a battery electric vehicle, and then let it run on the one common fuel in all cases, you discover that the fuel cell vehicle is actually the least efficient of the three. The hybrid electric vehicle running on natural gas is slightly better, and if you charge the battery electric vehicle from the most modern natural gas power plant possible, it's the best of the three, but that's not correcting for the cost and the weight of the battery and things like that. And you'll see on this chart that on the U.S. average, an electric vehicle is pretty much equivalent. So looking at it from the vehicle point of view, there's really nothing to choose between these three. It's really about what the fuel is. So the essential points I want to make here is that after 2025, I'm repeating myself, further reduction has to come from the fuel, that we only have three viable carriers of that energy. The efficiencies in the vehicle are about equal. From a customer point of view, we would prefer to use a hydrocarbon liquid simply because we know a lot about it. It's the cheapest system to put into the vehicle, which the customers like. It also has the highest energy density and the highest fill rate. Gaseous fuels, meaning methane or hydrogen, could be made to work if they were compelling due to their upstream advantages, and that they have to prevail over some fairly significant downstream disadvantages, namely the time to fill them and their cost. So what I'm asking for is that the focus be on the source of the renewable energy, not the form it takes as renewable transportation fuel. And things to keep in mind are that fuel has to be standard. We hear about this concept of drop-in fuel, where you can make a specific hydrocarbon from a specific type of plant and then dilute it into a much larger pool of fossil fuel. Well, that doesn't work when that pool is only, say, 20% fossil fuel. We really need to use fuels that are feedstock that can go into fairly conventional refining systems, which are very expert at turning one hydrocarbon molecule into another. And those systems are already quite efficient at scale. So the bottom line message here is that whatever the compelling renewable fuel is of the future, all the car makers will build vehicles that will use that fuel. But the other way around, trying to force technology, either force toward electric vehicles or forcing toward fuel cell vehicles, does not necessarily cause the right renewable fuel to appear. So what I really ask for in these types of discussions is to focus on the source of the energy from which the fuel was synthesized, rather than the specific form of the fuel. And for example, we just heard about natural gas. If you go back to my first chart, even if natural gas could be implemented absolutely perfectly in transportation, which would result in about a 30% reduction in CO2 per kilometer, that is only 7 years on my curve. So the 2025 will shift only out to 2032, and then we would still need renewable fuel. So that's such a short period of time. What I'm asking for is to pay attention to the long picture and where the renewable energy comes from. And if it's okay, can I skip to a slide that starts a little bit more discussion?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I need to go down to one of my hidden slides here. which I can't seem to get to. Okay, can you get me down to that one that says sources of renewable, down, down? Keep going, keep going. Nope. This one, right. So if we just make this an argument of scale, let's wait a moment while the picture comes up. There are really, we can look at the world through the three prospective sources of non-fossil fuel, which is really the source of non-fossil energy. It's sort of oxymoronic to look to the petrochemical industry, which is a fossil fuel industry, for a source of non-fossil fuel. And it's pretty obvious why, as an industry, it would not have much of a motivation to participate strongly in this, that it exploits this growing reserve of recoverable fossil fuel. Unlike the automakers, they're not really held accountable for the downstream emissions from the product. And of course, there's not much of a business case, which we just heard about, although there could be a tremendous business case in the processing of renewable fuels rather than in the fossil part of it. We heard a discussion about biofuels, which I refer to as sort of the agriculture energy industry, collecting sunlight into plant matter. And we just heard about the limitations on both sugar-based fuels, sugar-based ethanol or cellulosic ethanol, but they both have efficiency problems and difficulty being competitive. The one thing that's interesting is the connection to the electricity industry. It's the only sector with an energy scale that's comparable to transportation. It, too, is subject to tightening renewable portfolio standards. And it is also in need of massive grid energy storage in order to achieve integration of those renewables that will enable it to meet its renewable portfolio standards. So without presupposing any specific solution set, this would suggest that a connection between mobile energy and stationary energy could be essential to our pathway forward, and I would leave it at that just to promote discussion.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thanks to all of the panelists. This is Gary Dirks, and I'll be leading us through a Q&A session. And this would be a good time to remind the audience that I will be taking questions at any time, so please use the question function to send the questions in to me. And Ed, you are going to be showing here, I assume in a moment, the slides for the questions for the panelists that we have pre-prepared. And while we're waiting for that to come up, I have a question that really follows on from where Mike left off, and I'll put this to all of the panelists, but probably specifically to you, Paul, given your background in fuels. What about the competition between biofuels and food? Is this something that is real, and do we need to be concerned about it?
Okay, my answer will probably make more sense if I'm not on mute. Okay, yeah, actually, I've just been part of a few conversations about food versus fuel and food, energy, water nexus, and what I would say is we absolutely have to watch out for the impact of biofuels on food. Because I'll mention a calculation that I did some years ago. I took the world production figures for cereal grains, which is where the world, especially the poorest people in the world, get most of their calories. And if you took every cereal grain in the world, all the wheat, all the corn, all the rice, all the oats, all the barley, every single ounce of cereal grain produced in the world, and converted it at maximum theoretical efficiency to ethanol, you would displace less than 20% of the crude oil. So, you know, the thing that means to me is that the scale of the energy industry is so large and with technology now, pretty much allowing us to freely interconvert food and fuel, we have to be careful about that. So that's being careful is one point. Another is these things tend to work themselves out in the long run, but that tends not to be very comforting to people who starve to death in the short run. So this is an area where we can't just wait for market forces to work things out. We have to have regulatory backups to make sure that serious food consequences don't result from production of renewable fuels. That being said, I think that most of what we've heard about food versus fuel so far is hype. I think most of it is generated by people whose wallets are filled by the production and use of conventional fossil fuels, and so they'll say anything they need to say in order to try to turn the public against renewable fuels. I only really know of one significant instance where that started to happen, and the Europeans very quickly regulated their way away from that once they realized the impact that was coming forward. So I think we've seen very little of real food versus fuel. We do have to be careful about it in the future. I think we can do a lot with existing waste material, be that urban waste or agricultural waste or forest waste. And I think that is the low-hanging fruit we should be starting with. And then with care, we can potentially introduce energy crops and expand that further.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. I have another question from the audience for the whole panel. In the absence of international agreements or federal policy to place a price on carbon, are there things that states or regions within states can do to exploit the potential of their biofuel stocks? What end market sectors are most ripe for development? Short-range freight transport, intercity, personal transport. So basically the question to the panel is, are there things that can be done at a more local level that might promote low-carbon fuel?
I can take a shot at that, Gary.
This is Sharon.
Oh, go ahead,
Okay,
Sharon.
I was just going to say that I think that Paul's previous answer is part of this answer too, which is there is some low-hanging fruit in terms of crop waste, woody biomass waste, municipal solid waste, although that might be better for heat rather than for fuel. And I think that for every state to look at what it makes sense for that state to produce is a very good plan, a very good way of looking at it. So it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer if you're talking about what is economically feasible to produce at this point. I think it gets more interesting too when you go overseas to countries where just because there's plentiful hydrocarbon resources or fossil fuel resources doesn't mean people can get them where they need them, when they need them, at an affordable price. So I think that gets more interesting when you go overseas too, with all the cautionary notes that Paul just sounded about making sure you're not setting up a competition between food and fuel. But I think that there are lots of opportunities for that in the sort of low-hanging fruit category.
Yeah, and I agree 100% with both of Sharon's points. I think in the United States, the development of the rural economy is one of those things where if it's done right, a region or a state or a county can benefit a great deal from these things. And so if they can find some way to share that value with private investors, they can get that private investment attracted. I also agree with Sharon's point about some of the opportunities overseas, and I'll just add one thing to that. There are places in the world, some of them among the most oil-rich countries in the world, where the development of agriculture is stymied by the cost of fuel. So I think there are places where devoting a small amount of the agricultural capacity to the production of fuel, not for export but for local use, could really reinvigorate agriculture in those sectors.
Thanks to both of you. Mike, I have a question here from the audience that I think you could best kick us off
Do you
with.
mind if I go back to the food versus fuel?
No, please do. Please do.
Just very quickly, just in terms of this local answers, yes, it's always good to look for local opportunities, and I agree there are many of them, but we mustn't forget the scale. That, at its peak, the U.S. was using 130 billion gallons of gasoline per year. Our goal is to reduce that effectively to 27 billion gallons a year by 2050, right? And that's fully accounted gallons. That means if I have another gallon of fossil fuel in there, it has to be a zero carbon footprint. Non-fossil fuel has to be a zero carbon footprint fossil fuel. That's part of the very renewable fuel. So it's part of the very complicated bookkeeping here that also goes into the food versus fuel question, is just how much CO2 in net did we really mitigate by using a biofuel. But so we have to be very cautious about how we think about that. And the other part, though, when we talk about food versus fuel or land use, all of the so-called renewable fuel or biofuel, and we use those words interchangeably almost, are based on concepts where all of the energy that's in the fuel and all of the energy that it takes to convert the fuel from its original form into the fuel came from the biomaterial. If you move to a hybrid process like the one I was hinting at, where about half of the energy actually comes from electricity, and the carbon, and you're only extracting carbon from plant matter for the purpose of being the energy carrier, you end up getting about 5 times as much fuel per unit biomass that you bring to your plant. So between that and the fact that we're only trying to make 27 billion gallons, not 130 billion gallons, plus that 5-fold efficiency improvement, puts this kind of using plant carbon as the energy carrier actually well within the realm of possibility.
There's one more point I wanted to make, and I guess this is sort of a summary comment, which is I think that the way we're going to solve this too is if we segment this market, these end uses, and talk about where we really need to have liquid fuels, where there is no other alternative. Because I think, from Catherine's presentation, there are places where natural gas is going to make sense. There are places, when you listen to Mike, there are places where electrification or hydrogen or other things are going to make a lot of sense. Personal vehicles, there are some options there. Fleet vehicles, there are a lot of options there. But there are places like air travel where it's going to be really hard to find other fuel sources. If we can narrow down the part of the end use sector where we really need to have liquid fuels, then all of a sudden talking about renewable fuels or biofuels is a lot more doable. And so I think, over the long term, that seems to me like if we can narrow it down to what problem are you solving for, what end use are you solving for, then we're talking about something that's a lot more doable. So that's kind of my closing thought.
Okay.
Thanks, Sharon. I've got a question here from the audience that I think, Mike, you could get us started off on, and it has to do with recent developments in battery technology and the use of solar PV. And specifically, could you envisage solar combined with high-performance batteries as being a way in which we could be powering electric vehicles in the future?
That's a favorite subject, and unfortunately it gets exceedingly complicated. First, just take the battery electric question independent of the solar, the photovoltaic piece. And that is, battery electrics have very significant limitations of their own, which both in cost, in range, and the time it takes to refuel them, in quotes, that would either have to be overcome or compensated for by other benefits. So it doesn't automatically follow that battery electric vehicles are acceptable vehicles or necessarily an improvement. When you add in the solar PV question, it makes it sound extremely attractive because you have a vision of self-sufficiency of transportation, which can be very compelling. But if you think of it this way, that if I had a unit of solar power available to me, a kilowatt hour of solar power, and I had a choice between putting it into an electric vehicle and not driving a gasoline-powered vehicle, or purchasing less electricity from a typical U.S. utility, and asked which one of those options had the higher CO2 footprint, the answer is going to be that the electric car will have the higher CO2 footprint than if you had just left your ordinary car out there and bought less coal-fired electricity. So we really have to view this as an interconnected system, because you can have local solutions that look good that are actually working strongly against the broader solution.
Thanks, Mike. We have a number of...
I don't know if I helped or hurt, but that's the answer.
We have a number of comments, Catherine, about natural gas, and quite a number of them raise the question of just how effectively do we think we can lower carbon emissions using natural gas, and then several of them about the process of fracking. Could you say a little bit about how the industry is progressing with respect to managing the process of hydrofracking and the stability of output from the wells? Where is this all getting to?
Sure. Several questions in there. They're all good. All very thoughtful questions. So the first thing on the carbon side, because of the chemistry of natural gas, large, almost entirely methane, CH4, you have fewer carbon atoms per molecule than you do with many other hydrocarbons. So that's just a more technical way of saying when you combust natural gas, you get less CO2 out than you do with most other hydrocarbons. So we already have an advantage at the tailpipe on the CO2 score of perhaps 20% to 30% lower carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, compared to conventional fuels like gasoline and diesel. And it varies depending on the efficiency of the vehicle, which depends on the class of vehicle, for example. Now also we are making those engines more efficient, and so at the tailpipe that there's room, and of course diesel and gasoline engines can also become more efficient as well, but we've got a little bit of a gap there. We've got some technical room to catch up, and so that 20% to 30% spread at our advantage at the tailpipe could conceivably get a little bit better, depending on how all the vehicles improve in energy efficiency. So that's at the tailpipe, but the questioners are right to think of the bigger picture and to think about where that natural gas is coming from and emissions across the whole value chain. So I'll take the fracking question as actually, I often find that is a shorthand for larger concerns, not just about the process at the wellhead, but about the whole delivery system. How environmentally responsible are we being as we take natural gas from the wellhead through the interstate transport, through the distribution, all the way to that end use in the vehicle. And there is good news on that score, that as we are continuing to invest in and improve our natural gas delivery infrastructure, and largely those improvements have come because we upgrade our pipe continually. The materials that we are using now are significantly better and tighter and lower emitting than materials that we were using even just a couple of decades ago. And even though we're making those upgrades and modernization efforts on natural gas pipeline in the name of safety and reliability, we bring along this important co-benefit of environmental responsibility and lower methane emissions, so a lower greenhouse gas footprint for our systems overall. And to give you a sense of what that trend line looks like in our members sector, the distribution sector, we just released a study that we did with the Environmental Defense Fund. It was actually conducted by Washington State University that did a national survey of distribution pipe and compared that to the data that EPA currently uses, which is from the 90s. The 1990s data that's in the current EPA inventory says that 0.24% of natural gas delivered is lost in methane emissions from distribution pipe. What the data says is that if we look at the systems today, after 20-some years of improvements, it's paying off. And instead of 0.24% methane emissions rate, our methane emissions rate is now between 0.1 and 0.2%. So it's getting better. We can do more, and the industry is committed to doing more. But the same can be said on hydraulic fracturing. We don't represent the natural gas producers, but of course work closely with them. Their industry has also turned the curve down so that emissions from the wellhead associated with production are also trending in the right direction. They're trending down with green well completions. So there is always going to be room for improvement, but the industry is taking this very seriously, because we know that this is part of our social license to operate, to develop and deliver natural gas in an environmentally responsible way. And I hope that answered the questions.
That's great, Catherine. I've got one last question here from the audience that I'd like to put to all of the panelists, and then we'll do a quick wrap-up. And that question, not too surprisingly, has come from a number of our audience members, and it's specifically about carbon tax or something having to do with taking into account the costs of carbon emissions. Looking into your crystal balls, well, first to all of you, does some sort of price on carbon make sense to you? And looking into your crystal balls, are we going to have one anytime soon?
Shall we go?
Catherine, maybe,
go ahead.
Sorry, please go ahead.
Okay, this is Paul Bryan. As I mentioned in my first slide, based on extraction and refining only, renewable fuels are not going to compete with fossil fuels, and that's because fossil fuels basically have an open license to dump all of their CO2 into the atmosphere at no cost. So I think the only way we move the needle on that is to put a significant cost on carbon, either through penalizing the fossil fuels or subsidizing the renewable fuels. We definitely have to hold the renewable fuels accountable for all of their energy use, as Mike implied in his conversation. The fact that it comes from renewable plant matter doesn't magically make it good with respect to greenhouse gas footprint. It really has to be good to get that benefit financially, but we absolutely have to do that. I'm rather pessimistic about it happening. The Supreme Court in this country has legalized political bribery, and the oil industry has a lot of money. So they're going to be spending it. They are spending it quite significantly to keep the profits flowing to themselves and their shareholders. And until we find a way to overcome that, we're not going to have serious carbon legislation. The EPA's announcement today of the new renewable fuel obligations is pathetic, and it's not even at the percent level of the legislative intent, and a lot of that has to do with the oil companies being very deep in the pockets of our legislators.
Thank you, Paul. Any of the other panelists care to reflect on carbon pricing?
Do you mind if I comment? Just
Please.
quickly. Yeah. Without saying I want the carbon tax or want a specific scheme, regulations on specific industries that require them to reduce their own carbon footprint in effect do put a cost on carbon. It's just the cost of staying in that business. So I would look at it a little bit the other way around. That the problem is not that we have not put a price on carbon, it's that the price on carbon is very different in different places. So we should look first in terms of trying to have a market in carbon and then worry about the price of that carbon. because the present regulatory regime, because it in effect puts a local price on carbon and then attempts to hide that price from the general public so that they can be left with the sense they got something for nothing, is probably, if you tried to think of a more inefficient way to achieve the goals, that would probably be it. So my response is, it's not that we have to invent pricing carbon, we just have to allow the price of carbon to equalize between applications.
Very good. Other panelists care to say anything? If not, some closing remarks. Catherine.
I would just thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate, and also to thank my co-panelists. I tremendously benefited from your remarks, and glad to be part of today's discussion.
Thank you, Catherine. Sharon.
I accidentally sort of already made my summation comments, but you know, it's a really interesting discussion, and one of the things I really like about this discussion is that it's a practical one. Is that we're talking about what can actually be done, what should be done, what might be done, instead of just you know, building a castle on the air. And so I think that's got to be part of the answer. And you know, it was a leading question about carbon taxes. I think we all recognize that if you can't find a way to put a price on carbon, or at least a price on what it costs to clean up carbon, that it's going to be tough going. And it's so easy to be pessimistic about that in our political environment. But we've got a presidential election coming up, and there will be some kind of change. And I hope that, so I've been pessimistic about whether in our political system there's any chance of something like that, but I'm choosing to think that maybe the kind of political change we're about to see might open up some new possibilities, as long as we get these practical voices in the mix.
Thank you, Sharon. Paul?
Yeah, I think that we desperately need to improve the sustainability and reduce the carbon footprint of our energy use, whether it's for transportation or stationary power generation. We have to do that in a thoughtful way with regard to food and water and other societal needs, but we have to do something serious, and we have to start doing it soon.
Thanks, Paul. And last but not least, Mike.
Without too much repeating what I said earlier, I would back up even farther and just ask anybody who's thinking about this in terms of what they'd like to do as a researcher or as an investor or a voter, is to keep in mind that this is a system, the parts are interconnected. It has a scale that's much bigger than people who aren't directly involved can really imagine. The simplest way to think about the goal is to essentially stop using fossil fuels over the next 30 or 40 years, period. There might be reasons very locally and for specific applications where you still would. And the other thing is to pay attention to marginal effects. For example, if I had a choice between moving a unit of natural gas to a car or to a coal-fired power plant, my marginal CO2 reduction is somewhere between 2 and 4 times higher if I displace coal than if I put it into transportation. So we have to make the right investments and make them in the right order. And then what I would imagine is we could walk away eventually with the climate change mitigation plan that the Wall Street Journal would endorse. That's my dream here.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and I think that's a great way to end the panel discussion. So to all of the panelists, thank you very much for really stimulating presentations and some great answers to the questions. To our audience, thank you as well. I apologize we weren't able to get to all of your questions. There are many great questions here, and please do join in on the discussion on LinkedIn. That'll be a great way where you can continue to follow this conversation, and we'll try to get more of your questions answered there. And with that, Ed, over to you to wrap us up.
Thank you, Gary, for really moderating a great session, and thank you to all of the panelists, Mike, Paul, Catherine and Sharon, and to the audience especially. I want to call you over to the Security Sustainability Forum website, ssfonline.org. Registration hasn't opened yet for the remaining webinars in the series, but we will be addressing some of the sources of fuel fuel sources that we touched on here but haven't gone into that deeply, coupling the electric power and transportation sectors and looking beyond electric vehicles, recycling CO2 to liquid hydrocarbon fuels. And then we're going to wrap this webinar series up with a session on metrics to use to address the promise to try to get us into a more decarbonized world. So look for that on our website, and since you have registered for this session, you'll automatically get an email when those webinars are scheduled. And I want to thank you again for attending. You'll get an email in a day or two with access to the video, and also you'll be able to download the slide presentations. Then they'll go into our archives. And I just encourage you to join the Future of Sustainability Transportation Fuels LinkedIn group, where you can continue this discussion and help us frame up the rest of the webinar series. Please take the brief survey at the end. And with that, I'm going to end the webinar and just thank the audience again for sticking with us to the very end.